So, good evening, everybody. I am the chair of CAGNE, Communities Against Gatwick Noise and Emissions. CAGNE was formed in 2014, and I've been re-elected every year to be chair of CAGNE. I'm delighted to welcome you all. Thank you so much. And firstly, I have to apologise that we had to postpone the original AGM. But unfortunately, with all the power cuts due to the horrendous weather we had, it left me with my phone and most of the committee without electricity, including myself. So we had no option but to postpone in the end. We did hang it out there until the very last minute. And I really appreciate our speakers joining us this evening, having hand to read it. So quick rules for the evening event. If you have questions, please place them in the chat room so that I can see them and we can put them to our speakers later, or when we come to the AGM after the speakers, we can address your questions then. Please keep your microphone off because we get feedback. And if you wish to speak, then raise your hand and I will try and come to you during the question and answer session. So that would be appreciated. This meeting is recorded, as we said, because it will go on our YouTube channel. We are aware that this date has clashed with a number of council meetings. So whereas we had nearly 100 attending the AGM, the original date, I think we've got about 50 registered for this one. So we are recording this, and it also saves me from typing up all the minutes of the AGM. We'll move to the formal AGM part after the guest speakers. Questions will be taken after both speakers have spoken, and it moves me straight on to pass over to the president of CAGNE, which is Sir Nicholas White, and I'm delighted that he is now going to introduce our speakers. And Sir Nicholas.
Yep. Thank you, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted that you've all been able to join us because it is a very, very important meeting, this one. And I particularly want to thank the whole committee and especially Sally, who really works over the odds all the time and has produced some amazing results. And we do need, because of our proximity to Gatwick Airport, to be really truly heard by everyone at Gatwick. Now, I would like to introduce Jeanette Towie, who is the Southeast Ambassador for the Conservative Environment Network and Policy Coordinator for Southeast Conservatives. Currently, she is a trustee for Sussex CPRE, helping them network with local MPs and councillors and providing input on planning issues based on her previous experience as a district councillor. During her time as a councillor, she also took part in the 2017 Gatwick Arrivals Review, and along with Wealdon MP Nas Ghani, met with Stuart Wingate to discuss the noise generated by low-flying aircraft. Over to you, Jeanette.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. And I'd like to say thank you to Sally for asking me to speak to you. I think you've actually just covered off the beginning part of my speech, but so be it. So in addition to all of the things that have just been listed, I'm also a landscape painter. So I do rather kind of live and breathe all things to do with the environment. But for the purpose of this evening, I thought I would talk mostly about, obviously, what I discovered in my research around the sort of arrivals review and everything else, and what I've been looking into since. So, like most of you, I imagine, I live beneath one of Gatwick's flight corridors. In my case, it's the arrivals route, and it wasn't always thus. But then Gatwick changed the whole thing, and So I started to notice not only could I recognise the EasyJet flights by the orange tail fin, but I could sometimes actually read the call signs on the fuselage underneath. They were coming over so low. Now, when you bear in mind that I live in Crowborough, which is about 20 miles away from Gatwick, I really didn't think I ought to be able to read those call signs. Now, that was about 5 or 6 years ago, and I was a Willing District Councillor at the time, and that enabled me to get involved in the arrivals review, which is when we discovered that some of the planes were not coming down using continual descent. They were coming down in stages, which is why we were having so much of a problem. It's also when I first found out about the famous Airbus wine. Of course, that's all now kind of history, because we now do have continuous descent, and then most of the Airbuses have in fact been refitted. But about the same time as that, Wilden was undertaking a review of what's known as NOx deposition on Ashdown Forest. Now, if you don't know what NOx is, it's the umbrella term for nitrogen dioxide, ammonia, and any other nitrogen compounds. And as any gardener will know, nitrogen compounds are fertilizers. And in an environment like Ashdown Forest, fertilizer is the absolute worst thing. The forest ecosystem is based on the fact that the land is infertile. And so nitrogen only encourages the more robust plants like gorse to thrive. And those drive out the rarer plant and lichen species, which give the forest its SAC status. Some of those lichens in particular are unique in Europe. So you can see why it's important to limit the NOx deposition. Now, the reason why Wilden was undertaking that at the time was because they wanted to know the impact of vehicle traffic as a result of increased housing development. And for anyone who's in or around Wilden, you may be aware that there have been all manner of interesting rules about no housing within 15 kilometres or 7 kilometres or 300 metres, or various different rules at various times. So it was assumed by the council very much, and I think most authorities for that matter, that NOx deposition was as a result of vehicle traffic, particularly diesel vehicles. Now, given my sort of interest in nature and everything else, I regard Ashdown Forest as one of the jewels of England. So I was quite interested to know what came out of the review. And unsurprisingly, as the review went through it, and it lasted 3 years, as a general rule, the worst NOx deposition was near main roads, the A22 and the A26. But there were also high levels in parts away from the forest. Now, I'm going to see if I can share my screen, because I'm going to show you if I've got it handy. Whoops, let me see. Oh, well, this is interesting. Don't seem to have the one I want. Hang on a minute. Sorry about this. It's always the way, isn't it? It's giving me that one, but I don't want that one. No, I want that one. What's that one? Oh, this is embarrassing. Doesn't seem to want to do it. If I just pull it up on my screen this way, let's try this. I think I've got it now. Sorry about that. This is a new one for me. That's what I want. So can you all see that? A map. Can we see that? No, I've got nodding. I've got heads saying you can't. So I'll try again. Right. Can we see that now? Look, jolly good. Okay. So this map, as you can see from the scale down the side, shows you it shows you the forest, and it shows you the different colours. The colours relate to the amount of nitrogen that was deposited on the forest. So you can see, these are the main roads where the orange bits are. You can see that some of this sort of dark blue, which is the next sort of concentration, goes some way from the roads, and there's whole areas like here which are nowhere near roads, which have got a certain amount of deposition. Now I'm going to find another, I've got another one I'm going to try and show you. What this bar chart shows is that the further away you get from the roads, you can still get high NOx. So these measurements here are the distance from a road. And you can see that you've got quite high levels, in this particular case, some way from the road, in fact, higher than the ones next to the road. Now, as more data became available, and in particular as it became analysed, it became clear that it was actually wooded areas that were getting the worst deposition. Another one I can show you. Again, even somewhere away, like at 420, this is a wooded area. You can see how much worse it is than some of the areas nearer to. And in fact, what they discovered was that 63% of the NOx deposition across the forest is in the woodlands. So let's find this one. So you can see this map here shows you the deposition. You can see the extent to which the woodland is taking all of the nitrogen deposition. Now, I'll stop sharing for the moment. I can work out how to do that. Which I don't seem to be able to. Never mind, we'll leave that there for the time being. We know that trees capture pollution. In fact, it's one of the good things about them. But for that to happen, pollution needs to drop onto the trees. And that's where it gets quite interesting, because most of the NOx deposition, so the nitrogen dioxide and so forth, is heavier than air. So although ammonia itself is actually lighter, wet ammonia, when it's damp, is heavier. And of course, generally speaking, around here, well, isn't it damp? So, so if the NOx is heavier than air, why is it accumulating in the trees? And that's where Gatwick Airport comes in again. Because I mean, I'm not a physicist or an environmental scientist, but I am pretty logical and I know how to use the internet. So it struck me that if the pollution is coming from above, and Ashdown Forest is under one of the flight corridors, the corridor, then maybe it's the planes that's causing the concentration in the trees. So when I mentioned that to Noscani, she invited me to meet with Stuart Wingate, and I explained my theory to him. He looked a little bit confused, and then he came up with what I think is the craziest explanation ever. He informed me that the NOx deposition was coming from channel shipping. Now, when you bear in mind, Ashdown Forest is 223 meters above sea level, you have to ask yourself, how on earth is this NOx deposition rising up from the channel, traveling 50 odd miles inland to hit our trees? I recently met with another CEN ambassador who happens to be a shipping expert. And when I mentioned it to him, he thought that was utter nonsense. Now, I also ran my theory about planes depositing NOx with someone I met from the Civil Aviation Authority, who happened to be speaking at a fringe event at a Tory conference a few years ago, and I grabbed him and asked him. He couldn't explain it, but he was open to the possibility that it might be due to what he thought might be aviation fuel dumping. However, and I'm going to try and do something with this sharing the screen thing again. This time, it's going to be, whoops, let me just do this first. Come on. I came across this report from an organisation called Sustainable Aviation, and you will see that it is looking at the interdependencies between emissions of carbon dioxide, NOx, and noise from aviation. So there are at least some people in the aviation industry who recognise that NOx can be emitted from planes. Well, where does that leave us? There are a few rays of hope, I think. Unfortunately, Wilden have given up on the NOx monitoring, so that's not and they don't seem to be able to explain what all the anomalies are, as they put it. But we do have Dr. Gary Fuller from Imperial College, and he's been looking at particulate pollution, and especially fine particulate pollution from Gatwick Airport and other airports, actually, and the extent to which it washes downstream from the flight paths. So you might recall from some of those bars I showed you that some of the bars had particulates on them. If I go back to you can see the orange ones here are particulates. So I think perhaps we might be able to inveigle him into looking at whether NOx deposition is damaging the forest as well, or another team like his. The other hope is that there are the tentative beginnings of a more sustainable form of airline travel using hydrogen, sunlight, and electric batteries, basically. Airbus have a concept design, and they're hoping to introduce planes like that in 2035. Now, whether that will be too late for the ecosystem of Ashdown Forest, I don't know, but I feel like we've at least got something to hope for now. And that's me finished.
Thank you so much. Thank you. To Nicholas.
Jeanette, thank you very much for that. That was very interesting. Now, can I introduce Bill Hemmings, who is the owner of Rosetta Advisory Services, is an independent consultant based in Brussels, providing advice on environment, climate change issues on international aviation and shipping. He draws on experience firstly in the Australian and Canadian governments, and then with Cathay Pacific Airways on international traffic rights. Negotiations, marketing and general management roles in Indonesia, Bahrain, the Benelux and Germany. Bill led the aviation and shipping teams in transport and environment from 2008 to 2020. So, Bill, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nicholas, and good evening, everyone. I appreciate very much the opportunity, and I'm sorry that that storm, whether it was climate change induced or not, upset your last meeting. Let me try and share a presentation. But maybe let me just thank Jeanette very much for fingering NOx. CO2 is about a third of aviation's climate problem. Contrails and cirrus are about 60%, and NOx is a bit more than 15%. I should say that I was born in Tasmania. And even though I spent 10 years in the diplomatic service, it hasn't got rid of all the rough edges. So I'm going to be actually quite direct tonight, because I think that the climate emergency means we should be actually completely honest. And the reality is that, bless their hearts, Jeanette, ICAO introduced NOx standards for LTO landing and takeoff aircraft, if I'm not mistaken, in 1982. 1982, about 40 years ago, recognizing that NOx around airports from aircraft was a huge problem. And if I'm not mistaken, and I can get the details quite easily, there have been 3 revisions. But we all know that ICAO is not run by governments, it's run by the airlines and by Airbus and Boeing. So of course, these standards are not stringent enough. If I'm not mistaken, Heathrow has a NOx charge. I don't know whether Gatwick has a NOx charge, a landing charge. If it doesn't, then I would say you should march into it. Mr. Whitehead, was it? March into his office tomorrow morning and demand one. Because the first thing you need to do is provide a financial penalty for aircraft to reduce NOx. Reducing NOx is not easy, because if you reduce NOx in the aircraft engine, you increase the CO2. There's a trade-off, not just in aircraft engines, in all engines, but that's been known for 100 years. And there are ways around it. And over the past 20 years, because, Jeanette, would you believe that your government, the UK government, along with the EU in 2005, when they were deciding to put aviation in the ETS, came out with a communication thumping the table and saying, we must have a regulation on aviation NOx. Can you believe that in 2005? There was a study commissioned in an impact assessment the following year, which said we must do something about NOx. In 2008, when the ETS was introduced into the, aviation introduced into the ETS, NOx was put aside, but the Parliament insisted that there should be a study. So CE Delft, which is probably the premier aviation research organization consultancy in Europe, had a whole stack of experts, including David Lee from Manchester University. And they came out with a 250-page report saying, yes, we need to do something about NOx. And the first thing we need to do is put a charge on it, right? And if you'd put a charge on it, then there would have been an incentive for airlines to reduce. And in the meantime, manufacturers did start to look at the ways that they could reduce aircraft NOx without necessarily increasing the CO2, and they're called lean burn engines. The only problem is that Rolls-Royce were pretty hopeless in developing them, and they were too expensive, and because there wasn't any financial penalty, nobody has really pursued lean burn NOx engines. So there was the study in 2007, it was ignored. In 2017, the European Parliament, Brits were still there, called for something on NOx. EASA in 2020 finally did a report on aviation non-CO2. And can you believe that David Lee led the charge for saying, no, we don't want to mitigate NOx, because over time it will be overtaken by atmospheric changes. And so let's just focus on CO2. So scientists like that have let the whole industry off, and nothing is happening on NOx. So I'd be happy to talk further on that. And I will be talking a bit later on air quality issues, because I've been on CAGNE calls before, and I know you're also concerned about air pollution at airports. So let me get to the title. Forget about net zero 2050. It's just an excuse for greenwashing. And we used to think that 2030 is the new 2050, and let's do something by 2030. And indeed, the EU and the UK have these shorter term targets. But the reality is that 2030 starts today. It actually started years ago, right? And it's time to do something. And my message to you today is that the aviation mitigation movement and civil society, despite all their best efforts, is in extremely bad way, and things are going backwards. I applaud organizations like yourself for the work you do to stop airport expansion, and the victory at Bristol is fantastic. But we must go beyond just stopping airport expansion. Let me just, before I forget, there's a real NOx issue for aviation now in the Netherlands. I don't know whether you've heard about that. because Schiphol Airport is restricted by the number of movements because of noise problems, the smart people in the Dutch Transport Ministry looked down the road and they saw an old military airport at Lelystad and said, well, let's start this up at a low cost and we'll move all the low cost carriers there, right? But it's only about 30 miles away. And if you had, when they actually finished the airport, which is about 3 years ago, they worked out that the low cost carriers flying out of Lelystad would have to fly low to keep under the aircraft landing at Schiphol because the airports were so close. Lelystad is in the middle of an agricultural area and it already has a NOx problem from too much fertilizer, right? So can you believe that Lelystad is still not open now, largely because of a NOx problem? So I'm happy to put you in charge with the Dutch, who are effectively stopping this airport. By the way, the low-cost carriers said, we're refusing to move to Lelystad, and none of them have. The airport is still not open. So CO2, non-CO2, and airport air quality. Of course, we have to plan for the medium term. And maybe short-haul electric aircraft will eventually come about, and they're being looked at more particularly in Norway, where there's a lot of fjords and mountains, and it's difficult to build railways, etc. It ain't difficult to build railways in the United Kingdom, but around Scotland, etc., short-haul electric aircraft could be feasible. Give it about 10 or 15 years. Yes, people are talking about hydrogen aircraft. That's much more speculative, and it's basically being used just like the net zero 2050 argument to stop people doing anything now. If we all thought that 10 years ago Corsia was a stretch too far, we all now know that Corsia is a complete stretch too far. And the danger is that these promises of technology in the next 10 or 15 years, you're going to find in 10 or 15 years, if we're still around, that they haven't delivered on the promises. In the meantime, all the regulators have moved on or retired, and another set will come in there with bright ideas and think that they have so I'm sorry, I'm pretty cynical, but I've been around long enough in enough areas, including business travel, running American Express business travel consulting in Europe, and then with T&E. And I think, first of all, that it's time to really push regulators around. That officials, I've been an official for 10 years, and I think that we all treat them as if they're gods, but they're just normal people like you and I, and they really need to be confronted. So the CEO of airports need to be confronted, not in a violent way, but in a very direct way. The UK CCC needs to be confronted in a very direct way, and the government and Whitehall needs to be confronted in a very direct way. And if you can imagine, I think that's the same across the EU. Remember, you had Glasgow last year, right? And everyone was talking about net zero, blah, blah, blah. But in time, the message became true that, in fact, the IPCC and the International Energy Agency, and indeed the UK Climate Change Committee, are saying, no, we need to cut global carbon dioxide by 50% by 2030, which means if you don't start doing it now, and it's already 2022, we're going to be way behind. Unfortunately, Glasgow's gone, and people are going to forget that message. And my message to the UK NGOs and to CAGNE and others is that this climate emergency for aviation is getting bigger and bigger. Unfortunately, COVID was the precious time that we could have used. Never in the history of man has there been such a disaster. And having come from the airline industry, COVID has been a disaster for the airline industry. But it could have been the opportunity to start from scratch and build back better. And we've lost it because governments didn't want it. They wanted to subsidize their airlines. Industry obviously didn't want it. And I think NGOs have been blinded by, oh, we'll give you some money to look into hydrogen aircraft. We'll give you some money to look into that. But we all know that the first thing we need to do is price aviation properly, and that a £20 ticket to Barcelona from London is an absolute climate crime. I'll come on to that. I've said enough on that slide. So you need to price aviation properly. It's not. I don't know what the diesel and petrol cost in the UK is now, but it's still linked to a percentage of taxation, and the government haven't yet fiddled with that. And so most of the price you pay at the pump for your car is in fact tax, yeah? Whereas for aviation, the tax is absolutely zero. This is an absolute scandal, and the UK is as criminally responsible for that as anyone else, because it started in a convention in London in 1939, before the Second World War, that London hosted, where the whole idea of exempting international aviation fuel was developed. The idea was invented actually in America in the 1920s, but the UK has been extremely culpable in seeing that it is now virtually around the world, there is no tax on aviation fuel. I've been looking at your profile. You have a lot of short haul flights, but you also have a good number of long haul flights from Gatwick, or at least you did have before COVID, right? And you can see from this graph, it's been done by EASA and others, that it's the long haul flights where the fuel is really burnt, because you have to carry fuel to burn that fuel for a 9 or a 10 or a 15-year flight, a 15-hour flight. And so really it's long haul that needs to be beaten up first and foremost. We can do things about short haul, and there are endless studies about modal shift from aviation to rail. The only problem being, of course, you don't have a very good rail system in the UK, do you? And therefore it's not so easy to do modal shift. But remember that the problem really is long haul policy first. Let's get on to the UK. So you guys, along with the Americans in 1944, in the Chicago Convention, which is not responsible for the exemption on fuel tax, it was the UK-US Bermuda Treaty in 1946, which really created the template for exempting aviation fuel. Can you believe that the UK is now free of that restriction, at least for flights within Europe? Because the EU, during the Brexit negotiations, told Boris very clearly, we ain't going to let you have a fuel tax exemption for flights across the Channel. Because if we decide in Europe to tax fuel, you're going to cheat by taking all of your passengers over Heathrow tax-free and then on to North America. So the UK was forced to agree not to tax international fuel, right? What should then have happened, and the NGOs and civil society should have marched on Whitehall and said, God damn it, we're now going to tax fuel from the UK to Europe. No one other than Whitehall and Boris needs to agree. ICAO doesn't need to be involved. The EU doesn't need to be involved. It is an absolute right of the UK to tax fuel on every flight leaving a UK airport and going to the EU 27 and in fact the EEA. That is UK law and it is international law, right? Has it been done? Have you heard of people asking the UK to do that? If you taxed fuel from particularly from Heathrow to European airports, because BA is feeding all their transatlantic flights over Heathrow, right? What would the European Union do? They can't run to ICAO, they can't run to the ECJ, which would throw out the case anyway. They would react by taxing fuel in the opposite direction. And just as we've seen with Putin and Ukraine, it is power and force which will bring change. And if you guys in the UK would only get Boris to tax fuel on flights to Europe, then the EU 27 would become united at once and you would find there'd be taxation on flights across the Channel. Can you believe what happened instead? No, we'll have an ETS, right? And so you have an ETS now for UK domestic flights and for flights between the UK and Europe. But do you know what happened? Firstly, in the UK, and then the silly Europeans followed. Let's give them free allowances because there could be carbon leakage. Have you ever heard of anyone flying from Heathrow wanting to go to Frankfurt, either going via Tangier or via Turkey to avoid a tax? I've never heard of one. So it's absolute rubbish. So in fact, the UK government and then the Europeans reciprocated, used this lie about carbon leakage to use an ETS, which is a climate policy, to cheat UK taxpayers and European taxpayers by giving more than $1 billion a year, billion euros a year, or £1 billion a year to airlines who have these free allowances on the ETS. It's not just a shame, it's an absolutely crime. And I don't apologize for 1 minute about being upset about this, because I've spent the last 15 years fighting, and even some of your colleagues in the UK don't believe that we should have taxation. They're even arguing against the APD. The air passengers duty is the most beautiful thing that we have in aviation worldwide. It is the most strongest ticket tax which will come onto. So at least 42 countries. Boris could tax domestic flights tomorrow, yeah, in the UK. He doesn't have to ask anyone. And here's a list of countries which have done it. You know, the Philippines, Tanzania, Chad, Venezuela, Vietnam, Laos, Jordan, Kenya, but not the UK, which historically has been the second biggest aviation market in the world. And can you believe which country now is the biggest taxer of aviation fuel in the world? Does anyone know? The United States, who tricked the Brits after the Second World War. European aviation was on its knees. Let's exempt aviation from taxation. At the same time, the US has had a domestic fuel taxation for many years, and some American states, contrary to international treaties, but it's allowed, actually tax fuel on flights to Heathrow. The UK government know about this, but they would deny it, and they need to be put on the spot, just like the EU needs to be. Let me move on. Well, I've said most of it there. In a sane world, what I've just said would happen. And if we can get fuel taxation between the UK and the EU, then Boris and the Europeans go cap in hand to Biden and to Trudeau and say, it's now time to have fuel taxation across the Atlantic, right? Which historically has been the biggest aviation market in the world, and will be once again, once COVID, if we get past COVID, right? And the fact that the Canadians have been taxing flights, the fuel, all fuel uplifted from Toronto, which is the biggest airport in Canada, all fuel from flights from Toronto to the UK, maybe there are flights to Gatwick, there's certainly flights to the Heathrow, has been, the fuel has been taxed for more than 20 years, yeah? So it's not as if Boris needs to go and ask Trudeau. All Boris needs to say is, Mr. Trudeau, you guys have been taxing our aircraft, leaving Canada to come to the UK for the past 20 years. It's time to get past this charade, and we're going to tax you, and let's agree on an increasing tax so that it can actually work to cut travel. People talk about cutting corporates. You know, COVID has done a good job of cutting corporate traffic. I should know, I worked in the industry for 10 years. The issue now is that corporates have plenty of money, they're traveling less, but they should pay fairly for the travel that they do, but they don't. I was in the business of arm twisting airlines to give cheap fares to large corporates. When we had clients all over Europe, including in the UK, our biggest client was Airbus, spending 400 million euros a year 20 years ago, 15 years ago, right? So what we need to do is say to corporates, you guys have to convince airlines to work on international aviation mitigation, and to start by paying, and if you want to pay a fuel surcharge, surcharges have been legal for 40 years. They're going to come in again very soon now if they're not there already because of the fuel price hike. And you put a big fuel surcharge on corporate fares. So anyone who wants to fly business class, let alone first class, to the transatlantic has to fork out. It's peanuts for corporates, but it means something. But of course, how many people are knocking on Whitehall's door for asking that? I'm not aware that anyone is doing that. People are talking about a frequent flyer levy. All I would say is that I've not seen one credible study, let alone a legal study, how it could possibly be implemented. And since I've been in the airline business for 10 years, I should have some idea of how you would do it. And I cannot see how you could do it. But you can tax frequent flyer points. It was discussed in the US 20 years ago. And you can put fuel surcharges on corporate fares. And that would be the way that I think, let's do what's legal rather than have fancy ideas about what might not be legal or not possible. We talked about NOx. It's NOx and contrails, which are the main problem immediately for aviation. CO2 is the long-term problem because CO2 stays in the atmosphere for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Some of it stays for thousands of years, right? And so David Lee and the others are quite right that we have to tackle CO2. But that doesn't mean that you have to ignore non-CO2, and everyone's been ignoring non-CO2, even though the IPCC has been saying since 1997 and again in 2007, do something about non-CO2. And the Royal Aeronautical Society and Greener by Design have been working on this since 2015. The European Union did a study on this in 2020 and told Greener by Design and the Royal Aeronautical Society in writing to get lost. We don't want your help. And so we have a greenwashing report on non-CO2, and the UK is silent on this issue. There are ways to reduce contrails by flying slightly lower, and scientists at Imperial College have been pushing that. It is slowly getting some traction. There have been studies and trials in the Maastricht FIR. Greener by Design, the Royal Aeronautical Society were ready to do trials in the Shanwick FIR just before COVID struck on the Atlantic route, because that's where the main contrails are, and that's all been stopped because of COVID. But let's hope that comes. And the last thing I want to mention is particulate matter. Particulate matter from aircraft comes from two sources. Well, two sources from the jet engine. SOx, which depends on the sulfur level on the fuel, and also from black carbon soot. It's been known for a long time, and Kinetic did a study for EASA in 2011 saying it's easy peasy to get rid of the sulfur, and if you get rid of the sulfur, you'll get rid of the SO2 and you'll solve that particulate matter problem in airports everywhere. And that study has sat on the shelf for 10 years and is still sitting on the shelf. More recently, researchers discovered, it's already been known for diesel fuels for cars, that it's the aromatics, which are particular chemicals in diesel fuel, which actually trigger the soot formation in the combustion of the engine. And MIT in the United States in Boston, to their credit, have published two studies saying it's a bit more expensive, but it's also easy peasy to get rid of the aromatics in kerosene today. The incremental fuel cost is about 10 or 15%. The problem is that everyone loves biofuels, and we all think, well, a lot of people think that biofuels were going to save aviation, just like Corsia was going to save aviation, and just like hydrogen aircraft are going to save aviation. But we'll all be dead or underwater well before that matters, but before that happens. And the study was done 2 years ago, including by an eminent UK scientist was involved. And that study is still being suppressed by governments and by scientists in Europe. The European Parliament have demanded that it be released. And I think the answer is going to be, just as it was with NOx 20 years, get lost. Why? Because it will impose a bit of a fuel cost premium on refiners, and it will put the cost of fuel up for aircraft. But I haven't seen any airlines complaining about the war in Ukraine actually should be stopped because we need to lower the cost of gasoline. So in fact, people can pay more for aircraft flying, and they can pay to get rid of the aromatics and the soot. And you could actually have, within 2 or 3 years, you could have no PM problem from soot or from sulfur at airports. But because it's so easy, it will never happen. Maybe I'll stop there. That's the biggest lie of all. It's still on the IATA website. Oh, international aviation flies across the waters, which are not subject to anyone's jurisdiction. You know, we can tax Google and we can tax Amazon wherever they operate, but there's apparently, according to IATA, there's no way we should be able to tax airlines just because they're flying out in the nether. It's not even funny. If you want to read more on taxation, there's a few. If you want to know more about NOx, I'm happy to provide more detail. I'm sorry it's taken so long.
That was amazing.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sir Nicholas, over to you.
That really was. It was fantastic. And one just does not hear this sort of information. You're absolutely right, Bill. And somehow we've got to bring this to government. Now, are there any questions that anyone would like to ask either Bill or Jeanette?
I can't see any hands up, and I've nothing in the chat, and I can't see any hands up at all. I have to say, I'm attending the Department for Transport meeting tomorrow morning on air quality, and I've busily been taking notes. So thank you very much to both our speakers, because it's going to be helpful for me tomorrow with this AGNE meeting. But unless anyone would like to raise their hand now to ask questions, I think we've all been a bit blown away by the speakers. And anyone from the committee wants to ask a question, can you just raise an electronic hand, because I can't actually see you all. No, I think that's it. We've been blown away. So, sorry, right, Neil, we've got a question here.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
I will actually turn on my camera so you can see me too. Thank you very much indeed, Bill, and all speakers so far. Questions ready for Bill, I think, actually. Two questions ready. First of all, on the actual amount of air traffic, does Bill have any rule of thumb by which, by what percentage he thinks the amount of air traffic should be reduced by say 2025, in order for us to go some way towards meeting our CO2 reduction targets? And a question as well, actually, about NOx as well. While the talks were going on, I was trying to identify whether there was any scientific way of identifying the actual source of the NOx in the Ashdown forest. I couldn't see anything definitively. I sort of Googled quickly, but I was wondering if he knew, or if anyone knew of any way of identifying the source of the NOx by going down to isotope level.
Let me just answer on NOx first. It is true that NOx from shipping is a big problem as well, and the European Union and the UK have not handled it properly. And transborder NOx from shipping, particularly in Scandinavia, this was a real problem on sulfur 20 years ago, and that's why we got legislation to reduce the sulfur content of marine fuels. But this transborder pollution is a problem. So it could be, despite the height of the forests around Gatwick, that it is a little bit of ship pollution, but I'm sure it's much more likely to be NOx pollution. And in any case, if there's no charge at Gatwick, that's where I would march on your CEO tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, because it's not difficult to find a list of airports in Europe which have NOx charges, just as a lot of airports have noise charges, right? And they use the charges revenue to do double and triple glazing of houses around airports. Well, if you put a NOx charge on landing, it might make BA and EasyJet think twice about not putting lean burn engines in their aircraft if they had to pay an increasing cost for NOx. It's not difficult to measure the NOx. It's a function of fuel burn. And everyone knows what the fuel burn is because they have to report it every day to the ETS. On your first question, I mean, I think the first answer is that overall, aviation emissions have to be reduced in line with the EU target of minus 55% by 2030 against 1990 levels. So you could work out what that might mean by 2025. You'd have to see what the level of traffic is today. And it's only very recently, right, that borders have opened and long-haul flights are recovering. And the tragedy is that it's already too late. The horse has bolted. The UK and the European Union had a priceless chance over the past 2 years to actually put their foot down and to say to airline route managers, because I've been involved in all of that, you need to factor in when COVID finishes that you're going to have to pay for your pollution like everyone else. And had that happened, you would see that prices would go up and traffic would slowly come down. And my answer is if there is a tax or a charge and traveling doesn't come down enough, what do? Do you say that pricing doesn't work, or do you increase taxation? I would say you increase taxation. If it's good enough to have a 60 or a 65% tax on road fuel, and we know how Macron got his fingers burnt, right? Because he stupidly fingered road without actually fingering aviation first, and he's actually screwed it up for all of us. The APD is great. It puts a €200 charge on a business class fare. It puts a €500 charge on every rich oligarch who takes off from a private aircraft in the UK. It's wonderful. And you have civil society saying, no, let's get rid of the APD. We want a frequent flyer levy. So my answer is I can't give you a particular figure. But in the meantime, I wouldn't worry about that. I would march on Whitehall and say, give us a fuel tax and double. People are talking now about a carbon border tax, right? We're going to have a carbon border tax to stop all these cheap imports from China, etc., right? You know which countries had a carbon border tax for the last 20 years? Trump's America. They have a ticket tax like the UK, much lower. It's used to pay for airport costs and security and immigration costs at airports, right? But they've had it both on departing passengers like the airport duty in the UK, but they've had it on arriving passengers as well. Anyone who arrives in the UK pays $19.10 for an arrival tax. That's been there for 20 years. That is the world's first carbon border tax. And God damn it, Boris could be famous and have that tomorrow in the UK as well. I think that's my answer to your question.
Ian,
Good evening.
good evening.
Evening. I was out in Ashdown Forest on my horse when that Virgin flight circled around about 6 times, and certainly the air smelled slightly different on that day. So maybe it you know, sort of, maybe there is a problem with fuel dumping. But my question is slightly different. Again, I think it's for Bill. What about slots? And the keeping of slots, how does that work in terms? I mean, we hear a lot about you know, aircraft, you know, so the airlines flying in order to keep the slots. Is that another way that this could be attacked?
In a theoretical way, yes, but it's a very thorny problem. What happened at Heathrow is that they started to allow you to buy and sell slots, right? What happened when that happened? And this, I can't remember, it was about 10 years ago. BA's share of the slots at Heathrow went up by at least 10%, because the access to slots is your ticket to ride. Without a slot, you can't fly. So it didn't matter virtually what the cost of the slot was. BA bought it and they put them all in their pocket. That doesn't happen in Europe. And the way that they do it is they grandfather. Oh, you use this slot at 7 o'clock in the morning every day for the past year to fly from Frankfurt to Paris. And God damn it, the fares are high then, because they're going to screw the business traveler and they're going to make as much money as possible. And since you were lucky enough to have that slot at 7 o'clock from Frankfurt every day, every business day, we're going to give you a right in perpetuity to have that slot, right? In other words, we're going to hand you zillions of dollars. This is a public right. The right to fly an aircraft and use a particular slot is a public right, but it has been privatized and put in airlines' pockets. I don't know what the answer is, because if you auction them, the national carriers, because their pockets are deepest, and particularly where they are located. So if you auction slots at Gatwick, maybe EasyJet would buy as many of them as possible. And if that became too expensive, remember, EasyJet can go back to Luton, or they can go to some other airport. So there's no really ready answer to that.
Does that answer your question, Ian?
It was a slightly different tack that I was thinking. If we're talking about flying less, what I was trying to do was take the flights out entirely.
Okay, so
that is, it's that direction, right? I mean, I accept that there's two things, right? If you push the price up, right, like, you know, sort of, you know, we turn down our heating systems, we drive our cars less, but there was other things within it in terms of, you know, the stories that a lot of the flights that we're hearing at the moment are going out empty in order to guarantee the slots and things like that. If that wasn't a requirement, if we took that away, but it's an interesting answer from Bill, thank you very much, in terms of who owns it.
Yeah.
Because I think in everything that we look at these days, you know, sort of from who owns the right to have a certain area of the spectrum, who owns a slot in the North Sea to drill or in Balcombe, and who owns, you know, almost everything. I think that we've entered this sort of phase where we should look at it and put a price with it. And that should be something that belongs to the general public. And actually, I think that should apply to every greenfield that people want to develop on, you know, sort of how, you know, develop anything on around here. So it's it was quite a thought-provoking answer, but it wasn't the one that I was looking for, Bill.
I have another one for you. If you can permit me, another one as quickly as I can. The Dutch Parliament had this brilliant idea because they imposed it on Shell. We're going to cap your CO2 emissions annually. And so what's happened in Schiphol for the past 10 or more years is because of residents complaining about noise. This is the first time it's ever happened in a big airport in Europe. There are only 500,000 landings and takeoffs allowed at Schiphol. That's why they invented this crazy idea of having a smaller airport at Lelystad, but it's backfired because of NOx. Schiphol has now, before COVID, has met this 500,000 limit a year. And of course, there's enormous pressure to increase it, yeah? And that's why the Parliament said, well, let's cap the CO2. And it doesn't matter how many times you fly, but you can't emit more than this amount of CO2. That is actually translated in EU law, that it is actually the airport and the government authority which decides on the capacity available at every airport, the maximum capacity. Forget it, you can take account of no night flying, but so every airport theoretically has a maximum. You can't have more landings and takeoffs, yeah? And so that is the way to actually cap capacity at airports. Just as we're trying to cap CO2 in Europe at 55% minus in 2030, you can have national caps. So you could have a CO2 cap at Gatwick and at Heathrow. But have you ever heard of the civil society in the UK pushing that idea? Unfortunately, what's happened in the Netherlands is that the Transport Ministry got hold of it and industry got hold of it and the NGOs gave up. And now the whole process is a complete greenwash and you're not going to get a CO2 cap at Schiphol. But I don't see any reason why you guys can't look at a CO2 cap and do it in a proper way at the UK. And do that in conjunction with your campaigns, great campaigns to stop airport expansion. You cap the CO2, they can fly Cessnas as many times as they like, as long as they comply with noise and NOx and the CO2 limit. And that might encourage them to have electric aircraft and when I'm dead, hydrogen aircraft. But in the meantime, it is legal. I know how to do it, but the Dutch have screwed it up big time because you've got to remember that shipping and aviation is 30% of Dutch emissions, national emissions from those two industries. It's not anywhere near that in the UK, so there shouldn't be so much pushback.
Wow. So Nicholas.
Well, I'd like to thank both Jeanette and Bill very, very much. I think it's been absolutely fascinating, and I think it gives us an enormous amount to think about for the future as to how we actually do push this one forward. I think it's brilliant. Thank you very much, both of you.
Well, thank you so much, Nicholas. And I echo my thanks to both our speakers this evening. You're more than welcome to stay for our AGM, which we are now going to push into, but totally understand if you have other things that you need to attend to. But absolutely, really helpful and interesting, and lots of thought-provoking stuff to go forward with.
Thank you. I have a cold. I'm gonna go and have a whiskey, and good luck, and happy to provide any further information.
You're very kind, Bill, and thank you so much indeed. Lovely meeting you at last.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Okay, so it probably moves to me now to take this one forward. So I move to our formal agenda, and I firstly have apologies from Tony Reid, Sue Nupfield and Maggie Beeson, who is our Kent committee member. Lisa Morris is not with us as yet, who is a committee member, but I'm hoping she will be joining us. And Andrew Cadman, unfortunately our treasurer, can't be with us this evening. It's just one of those things when you change dates, etc. It doesn't fit in with all of us, but the majority of the committee are present and here now. So the item 3 on the agenda after our speakers was for the chair's report, and so if you allow me, I will give you the chair's report. So we've been a busy year, even though the skies may have seemed quiet to everyone. What a welcome respite we've had from the noise and from the emissions from planes not flying. Unfortunately, tomorrow Gatwick celebrates opening up their southern terminal. Anyway, you can hear about me on BBC Radio Sussex tomorrow morning talking about that. Anyway, CAGNE has continued to grow in workload, and I emphasise workload. And this year is going to be increased due to the modernisation of airspace and the development consent order as Gatwick seeks to go forward with rebuilding the emergency runway as a second runway. During COVID, the government and Gatwick Airport have kept us very busy. And so if you'd like to help us, and if you would like to deliver leaflets or volunteer in any way, please do so. And we are also looking for new committee members, because this is going to be a very busy year. So if you feel that you would like to join the committee, please email cagnegatwick@gmail.com. I'd like to personally thank the committee for their support over the year. And I also wish to thank all those that have helped and supported CAGNE, especially raising the awareness of Gatwick's plans to rebuild the emergency runway as a second runway. We have once again been faced by the noise group monopoly on the noise forums and the statutory bodies at Gatwick Airport, which ensures not all communities have a fair or balanced voice in debates. We have seen 2 studies being brought forward by noise groups, one to remove the Secretary of State noise abatement procedure, which is not to join the final approach, the instrument landing system, at less than 10 nautical miles. The other study is for fair and equitable distribution of airspace, but we see little chance of this being fruitful due to the monopoly of noise groups at Gatwick and the fact that the Civil Aviation Authority consultation process, CAP 1616, of the modernisation of airspace, which is called FASES, report this week looks to bring in arrivals at 5 nautical miles, as well as many new departure flight paths over new communities. For example, ADNID, the route that founded CAGNE in 2014. Much of the latter part of this year has been about raising awareness of Gatwick's plans to rebuild the emergency runway as a second runway. As you may remember, CAGNE launched Not Now, Not Ever campaign when Gatwick launched its master plan for 3 runways. This year, we focused on the environmental damage of a second runway that would have had on our planet, with our time is ticking series of virtual webinars supported by Friends of the Earth and CPRE Sussex, Surrey and Kent. We are delighted to say these were a resounding success, with our youth event being attended by Caroline Lucas, MP. We stood once again on the street corners, lobbied local authorities, MPs, produced factual reports, press statements and facts from residents so that they were able to respond to the over 1,000-page consultation document. Our mailings of postcards to over 1,000 homes was warmly welcomed, and we made sure Gatwick will include each one as a response in their complex consultation. We had our own eco van that travelled around Sussex and Surrey to raise awareness of Gatwick's plans for a second runway. And our strapline was "No second runway for a greener future." Whilst we were busy with Gatwick's van, parked in most obscure locations, was deserted. We thank all that helped to distribute leaflets, especially those in Brighton and Tunbridge Wells. We thank the solicitors and barristers that have advised us and not charged us to date. Our surveys have been accepted as we seek to engage with you all to ensure the right direction when putting forward reports. After many emails to the Department of Transport, CAGNE has finally been allowed to attend AGNE meetings, which is a major step for us, and I will be attending the one on air quality tomorrow. We are delighted that the National Noise Forum is now controlled by Aviation Environment Federation. AEF has been a speaker at our previous webinars and AGMs, and not an individual from the GACC noise group that has consecutively sought to move noise over other communities. We now face another busy year, and we expect the public consultation on FASs in May. We have already seen Gatwick intends to have arrivals joining the final approach at 5 nautical miles, significantly impacting those already impacted by arrivals and departures, but at much lower heights due to less distance to go. We do not know where this 5 nautical miles has come from. It could be said to be unsafe, but it is unclear that the noise groups further out asked about the join. And it is just devastating that these communities have not been consulted to date. So they'll be totally unaware of what is going on at Gatwick. We have already seen Gatwick seeking to fly over new residents with removal of noise preferential routes, that's departures, that have protected so many residents for so many years. Gatwick has specifically asked for AGNE, the trial route that caused so much anger in 2014. We seek new committee members, as we will have to tackle second runway development consent order proceedings, as well as day-to-day meetings of noise forums, government airspace meetings and FASs. Without your donations and the donations of Friends of the Earth and Lush, we could not have operated such effective campaigns. The pledge of £4 a year that we ask members to make helps us with our overheads on our website, Zoom costs and general admin, as all on the committee do not charge any expenses. In December, we held a virtual meeting to catch up with residents. Those that attended were asked for a Christmas wish. All put a ban on night flights. That was their #1 vote. So I would now ask you to accept my report and ask me any questions that you may have. Thank you. No questions. No one's talking to us. So that is the end of my report. I don't know if the committee would like to add anything, but I know I'm going to invite Jane, committee member, to give us an update on the Gatwick Noise Management Board. Jane.
Thank you, Sally, and good evening, everybody. I'm sorry, but I will be repeating some of the things that Sally has said already. but I'd like to update you on 2 studies brought forward by the NMB. The first one was, as Sally had said, the removal of the Secretary of State's noise abatement policy at night, and consequently the moving of the ILS joining point. The second study into the fair and equitable dispersal of aircraft. At the moment, no aircraft should join the instrument landing system at less than 10 nautical miles at night, although since the pandemic, we know that this has not always been the case. There's been a presentation on the study into the removal of the noise abatement policy at night, but that presentation raised more questions than it answered. I think I won't bore you with all the details. What I will do is read to you the conclusions from that report, and I quote, "Overall, the study findings have confirmed that changes redistribute the noise generated by arriving aircraft according to the new distribution of flight tracks, reducing noise impacts in one geographical area and transferring noise to new areas." If this study is allowed to go forward as part of FASIS, the join point could be as low as 5 nautical miles from the airport, and that will only benefit those further from the airport. The study results into the fair and equitable dispersal were delayed for quite some time, and the outcome has finally been put forward, and the outcome is inconclusive. The academics have asked for more time to carry on the study. The worry is that both these studies will be fed into FASIS, that's the Future Airspace Strategy Implementation South, and the modernisation of airspace, inconclusive or not. At the last surgery with the chairs of the Noise Community Forum and Noise Executive Board, CAGNE proposed an independent survey of all noise groups. This suggestion appeared to be welcomed by the chairs as a way forward. There has been geographical imbalance on all GAL committees since the beginning of the NMB, and this approach could have addressed the problem once and for all. Disappointingly, we've not heard back from the chairs of NCF or NEX. One can only conclude that once again, the issue of geographical imbalance is being swept under the carpet. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. I'm just going to ask for a vote to accept our reports. If you could just raise your digital hand, I'd appreciate to accept the chair's report, and the report on the NMB would be appreciated. Thank you. We have 5. That's excellent. Thank you very much. So accepted. Okay, I move on to the Treasurer's report, and this is a bit disappointing that Lisa's not present, which is unlike her. She was standing in for our Treasurer, Andrew Cadman, who's unfortunately away on business in this country, I point out. But I think she must have been held up. So if you'll forgive me, I will share the report. So this is our expenditure. So I'll just slowly move it up. The left-hand column, it says 2021, but obviously this is done to the end of December. We do up, yeah, they are 31st December. So this is more or less where we sit currently. So if I could just ask for you to vote to accept or raise your hand if you have any questions on the financial report. Any questions? No. Raise hands to accept the report. Thank you. The report is accepted. Thank you very much. Can I just add that some of the funds in there is ring fenced for legals against the plans for a second runway. So in actual fact, your £4 do help, please, every year, annually or monthly if you wish. Anyway, right, we go on to the important bit, which is the committee nominations. So it gives me great pleasure, with lots of twisting of arms, I would like to nominate our president to remain, Sir Nicholas White. Could I please have a seconder? Jane, can you raise your electronic hands, because I can only see about 6 of you. Sorry. I'm just going to go back to the gallery. I can see more of you. So Jane, thank you. Stephen, thank you. Okay, so Sir Nicholas, you are re-elected on that.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I have to now pass to Aidan. Where are you? There you are. Aidan, it's now your opportunity to nominate the chair.
Thanks, Sally. Sir Nicholas has mentioned the sterling work that Sally's done over the last 12 months and previously, and therefore I have no hesitation in nominating her to continue as chair of CAGNE for a further 12 months. Can people please raise their hands in a show of support? Can you see that okay, Sally?
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you, I think. And I accept carrying on as chairperson of CAGNE for another year. Much appreciated, and thank you for that, Aidan. Now it gives me great pleasure to nominate Aidan as vice chair. Could I have a seconder, please? Thank you. And Caroline, Jane, and could we just vote on that, Aidan, as second? Okay, thank you very much. That's great, thank you very much. And then moving on, we have treasurer, and I do sincerely apologise that Andrew is not here, but he is our IT guru as well as being treasurer and our compliance person. He controls our data protection, and we'd be lost without him. So I'm nominated Andrew Cadman to carry on as treasurer and IT. Could I have a seconder, please? Thank you, Aidan. And then can we vote to accept? Thank you very much. And then it gives me great pleasure to nominate the whole of committee to stand for another year. So could I have a seconder outside the committee, please, to nominate the remainder of the committee en bloc? Oh, who's that? Oh, okay, thank you. I've got that. Linda, Brennan, thank you. And then can I have a vote to accept? Thank you very much. That's great. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions for the CAGNE committee? This is your chance to ask questions of the CAGNE committee. If you just lower your hands. Right, Julie, have you a question? Is that an old hand, or do you have a question? I'm going to put your hand down. Anyone got any questions for the CAGNE committee? I'm just scrolling through your names at the moment. Aidan, have you got a question, or is that an old hand?
It's a new hand, Sally. I wondered if you wanted to take the opportunity to say a few words about the demise of ICANN.
Oh, okay. Yep, absolutely. That's a very good point. Very good point. Yeah, ICANN was the independent noise forum that was a government body that was brought about by the Department for Transport. It goes back to when it was Heathrow versus Gatwick for expansion of a new runway. And part of the Airport Commission's recommendation was to have this independent body that could act between the aviation industry and communities. And sadly, the DFT, the Department of Transport, removed ICANN. And the Civil Aviation Authority are going to take over the responsibility of that. Now, it will be a separate body of the CAA that will be taking over this responsibility, and it will be financed by government, whereas the Civil Aviation Authority relies heavily upon aviation for funding. So the Department of Transport are arguing very strongly that this new CAA environmental body will be independent. But ICANN was making real inroads, and we had them as a speaker at our AGM, I think a couple of times actually, and a bit skeptical about what they were going to do, but they were actually starting to recognise that noise was a real issue and it had real health implications. Their remit was not environment, CO2 or any of those things. It was purely noise. And if you smell a rat, we did. And we were very saddened to see ICANN go, because they were starting to put forward studies, real studies into the impact of aircraft noise. And they were also starting, we were pushing and others were pushing that they should have statutory powers. And it felt very much that the government was starting to feel, and the industry didn't like ICANN, because they're actually starting to give communities a big voice that are impacted by aviation noise. And so we will now have to wait and see what this new body does within the Civil Aviation Authority. At one point, they were going to appoint the CEO of Heathrow Airport onto this body. But the response from communities was great anger that this would happen, and he dutifully stepped down. I think watch this space, unfortunately, is all we can do. I raised it a number of times at the DFT meeting, Department for Transport meeting last month, and I was given assurances that this new body in the CAA will be independent of the industry. Perhaps I should report on this at the AGM next year, when we know exactly who will be sitting on this body and exactly the game plan. So that was a really good point, Aidan. Thank you for that. I admitted that out of my report, the demise of ICANN, very sad. Anyway, has anyone else got any further questions? Looking through here, I can't see any. So I will move to any other business if nobody has anything else for us. And one of the things that we feel, we have a number of policy documents on our website, which you may or may not have seen, but the one we haven't got, and it relates unfortunately to, oh, Judy, did you want to ask a question? No. One of the things we haven't got on our website is a data protection policy. And so tonight I'd like to ask that the committee adopt the data protection policy that was circulated earlier today. if the committee could just raise their hands, that would be great. Thank you. So that's adopted, and that will now appear under our documents on our website. I think it's increasingly important that we have these. We have various policies, obviously, when we were working with the youth groups, etc. And I think this one will just add to our policies, which is really important. So that's really great. And under any other business, I'd just like to offer Jenny, who is in the back room of CAGNE, the committee's thanks for all her hard work in keeping our websites updated, making sense of documents that I blast out at her because there aren't enough hours in the day. And so, committee, if you just like to thank Jenny. She's really an important person behind the scenes, and I know she's on our call today, but she's hidden away. Anyway, thumbs up from Jenny, so that's great. Okay, so it gives me great pleasure to say our AGM is over, and thank everybody so much, especially our wonderful speakers this evening. Much appreciated. So Nicholas, I don't know if you just want to add any last words.
I think it's been a very good meeting, and thank you for chairing it so nicely. And but it really is now up to how do we take this on forward and really bring the government to task. And because we've got to get these changes, there's no doubt about it. And if we can use Bill's information, I'm sure that might well help. It might be worth just finding out how much input he has into the government departments or transport, etc. But again, thank you very much.
Thank you for that. And I think what with that, and Gary Fuller, who did the talk on air quality as part of our Time is Ticking report, which found that the roads around Gatwick were far more polluted than the roads in London, and that's because of the particles coming off the airfield of Gatwick Airport. That is something that I will be raising with the Department for Transport tomorrow morning at the meeting. But I think, you know, CAGNE has made some major inroads this year. We've got huge new membership, which is fantastic, and huge support. And we've grown substantially, even though the skies may have been quieter. But I think we're all facing this climate emergency, which is very much at the heart of nearly all consumers now. We're all aware of this climate emergency or this climate crisis. And I think that if we all come together, we can actually, and we are making a difference. And those in power are actually starting to consider what we're talking about and is reality. And I think we've got elections next year of some councillors, and let's inform them that we cannot carry on as business as usual. Business has to be greener. So Nicholas, did you want to?
Yes, just one. I do feel that some of our MPs are not really responding as much as perhaps they should be. And I do think if Jeanette or whoever else can get involved on that, I think would be very helpful.
Very much so. Jane?
Yes, I agree with Nicholas there. Is Jeanette still there? I have a very quick question.
Yes.
Yeah. Hello, Jeanette. I'm an East Sussex resident, and you talking about your meeting with Nusgani, I've actually spoken to our MP Nusgani about the consequences on her patch if there is Gatwick expansion. I can't say that her response instilled much confidence in me. what are your views at the moment about the way MPs are reacting so far to Gatwick expansion?
The impression that I've got is that those MPs in the north, whose constituents are more affected by the traffic, by the aircraft noise, basically, are less inclined to be in favour. Those in the south see it as an opportunity for more jobs. And the same actually applies to East Sussex County Council. And in fact, a few years back, East Sussex County Council had a vote, and there was a 3-line whip by the Tories to vote in favour of Gatwick expansion. And the councillors in the north said, we won't do that. And in a complete break of normal policy, they were allowed not to vote and weren't expelled from the group as a result. So there is an understanding that in the north, we feel very differently about this to the way that the people in East Sussex in the south feel. NUS has a tendency to, like most MPs, to be fairly sort of circumspect in how she speaks about things like this. I have a very good relationship with her and work with her sometimes. So I can often get more out of her, let's put it that way.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you very much. But I think there's going to come a point, isn't there, where they really are going to have to stand up and be counted on this.
I think that's true. And I mean, I do have very good relationship with NUS. I have good relationship with Jeremy Quinn in Horsham, with Mims Davis in East Grinstead, with Henry Smith in Crawley, with Hugh Merriman in Bexhill and Battle. So I know all of them personally. I've got, I've got contact numbers and things like that. So hopefully I can help somehow.
Good, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, so I'm going to close the meeting, I think. So thank you ever so for everyone who attended this evening. Thank you, Julie, for thumbs up. And we really appreciate your support. And if you would like to consider joining the committee, please just drop us an email. We are a friendly bunch. We're not like a normal committee. We are all friendly, and we all work to one goal, and that is sustainability and making sure all communities have an equal voice going forward when it comes to the environment and Gatwick Airport and aviation generally. So thank you and good night.